We're just 2 minutes after the hour, so I think we're good to go and get started. Again, my name is Mark Leggett. I'm the Executive Director for Research Data Canada. And I would like to welcome you all to the final part in our 5-part series on data ownership, this one with a focus on open science. And we have two colleagues who are going to present and respond to questions. And our third colleague, David Castle, will facilitate the session. So I just have a couple of housekeeping pieces. So we will be recording the webinar, and it's generally made available a day or two after the live webinar is conducted. We do not record or maintain the transcripts of the chat, but we will let anybody who has registered for the session know when the recorded webinar is available, in case you wish to listen again or share it with colleagues. I will ask you to use the chat only for issues or challenges you may be having. And my colleague Christina is on the call, and either she or I will help. If you do have questions, and I would encourage you to ask questions as they arise, please use the Q&A option, and that you should have a button for that in the bottom of your Zoom window. And the Q&A panel simply allows us to be a little more efficient in responding to the questions and noting when we have responded. With that, I will introduce our facilitator for today. David Castle is a longtime colleague. He's the current chair of the Research Data Canada Steering Committee and is also a professor of public administration at the University of Victoria, where he's focused on science, technology, and innovation policy. David is also a director on the Canary Board and a member of the World Data System, or the WDS Scientific Committee. So David has good reach in not just the national, but international research data management communities. So with that, David, I will pass it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Mark. And let me just begin by encouraging everyone who perhaps hasn't seen the entire series that RDC has put on this fall to go and actually look at the recordings. As the series has been really tremendous, quality, very interesting and thought-provoking, and well attended as well. So you can over your winter holiday break, you can put on some warm socks and curl up with your laptop and watch RDC webinar series with the whole family. I would like to also just pause for 1 second and thank Mark for having created and curated this series and for shepherding it through. It's been really valuable, and obviously the community uptake of the webinar series has been terrific, and I think is really indicative of the kind of good quality work that RDC is capable of doing, and has certainly done under your leadership as Executive Director, Mark. So thank you very, very much for that. So today we are going to talk about open science and open data, and we have two distinguished speakers today to introduce us to their perspectives on these topics. Richard Gold is the James McGill Professor of Intellectual Property and Innovation at McGill University's Faculty of Law and Faculty of Medicine. And his research focuses on innovation policy and intellectual property, with special attention to open science models of innovation. And Leslie Weir is at Library and Archives Canada, where she became the Librarian and Archivist of Canada in 2019. And before that, she was the University Librarian at the University of Ottawa from 2003 to 2018. And during her tenure as librarian, she founded the School of Information Studies in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Ottawa, and was cross-appointed as a professor. So she's held positions at the National Library of Canada, and Statistics Canada Library, and holds a master's in library science from McGill University and a Bachelor of Arts in Canadian History from Concordia University. And so it's a great pleasure to have these two colleagues joining us today on this webinar. And each will give a short presentation. And then, as Mark indicated, we'll open this all up for question and answers. I will do my very best to moderate the Q&A session with Mark's assistance, and I'm looking forward to our speakers. So I'm going to turn the floor over to you, the virtual floor over to you, Leslie, to hear about your perspectives from the point of view of the librarian and archivist of Canada. So Leslie, all yours.
Thank you so much, David. I'm thrilled to be here today and talk a little bit about the Open Science Roadmap for Canada. So next slide, please. I wanted to begin by giving you a little bit of background in terms of the federal government context, because I think many of our listeners are probably already aware of a lot of the environment in the academic and larger research community. But of course, the federal government is a beast unto its own. And so I thought as background, it would be good for everyone to know that it was in October 2014 that the federal government came out with a directive on open government. And this was with the idea of transparency and making sure that people in Canada would have access to government record and information. It was in 2017 that there was a model policy that was developed on scientific integrity, which covers all of the researchers within the federal government family. At the same time, there was work being developed in terms of looking at information and data strategies. So in August of 2019, the Federal Data Strategy Roadmap came out. As the government moves from more of an analog model to a digital model, it was felt that it was important to move forward and develop a policy on service and digital, which just came out April 1st of 2020. And this is interesting, I think, because the Open Science Roadmap for Canada came out in February of 2020. So it was sort of in the midst of this environment, with a push on looking at how one can organize and manage data and information, and then policies in terms of access. And of course, Libraries and Archives Canada is the record of the federal government of Canada, and so is very interested in its responsibility in being able to archive and make accessible the government record. And believe it or not, both scientific articles, publications, and research data are all archival objects to an archivist. Next slide, please. So I think most of you are probably aware of Mona Nimmer, who became the Chief Science Advisor to Canada in 2017. And then this October just past was renewed for a new mandate. She felt strongly that her office should shepherd the process for developing an open science roadmap. She also felt that it was very important that the government not work within a government silo or bubble, but that the government actually collaborate and coordinate with the larger research and academic communities in Canada. So there was this desire to coordinate with, but also build upon the work that the Tri-Agency Open Access Policy on Publications and the Statement on the Principles of Digital Data Management that had been made in the preceding years. Next slide, please. So Mona decided that the best way to proceed would be to actually strike an advisory committee that could help her in defining what an open science roadmap might look like. And so Mona approached me actually as the former university librarian at the University of Ottawa. I was on sabbatical at the time. And she asked me if I would help her create this committee and chair it, so that we would be sure that we were making those connections with the larger communities. So interestingly enough, I list all of the members here just so, because some of you may know a number of them, but to me, the important focus in terms of the membership was that it is, the majority of people are actually researchers. And it was important that this be researcher driven. So while we did have the Chief Technology Officer for Canada, we also had the Chief Science Advisors for the Canadian Space Agency, for Science, Technology and Environment Canada, for Natural Resources Canada, and ensuring that we were representing the full corpus, a researcher from Statistics Canada, and as well from the National Research Council. That said, needs to be research driven, needs to look across the corpus of research and not focus, say, on the pure sciences or on any specific area. It was also felt that integration with what's going on in the rest of the country was very important. Next slide, please. So what we did was we invited a number of external people to join the membership who represented various institutions, including the U15, the University of Toronto, McGill, the University of Ottawa, and the granting councils. Next slide, please. I think what's really key in this approach for the roadmap for open science is that there were 5 guiding principles, and probably the most important one was people. And that's why it was put first, because it really is a shared commitment between all of the people involved in the research enterprise. And it was extremely important that the scientific community be integral to the development of the roadmap and the action plans that would fall from the development of this roadmap. It was also extremely important that it be open by design in terms of providing transparency, and that it be inclusive in terms of being diverse and inclusive, including traditional knowledge systems, not just our more formal knowledge systems in academic and research institutions. And that there be a great deal of collaboration, not only within Canada, but also internationally. And of course, that sustainability was extremely important, because once one is going to create something like a roadmap, you're really looking at how you can work together to achieve a long-term vision. Next slide, please. So there were 10 recommendations. Hopefully many of you have seen this roadmap, you've read it, you're excited by it. I just thought I'd highlight one recommendation, the first one, which was that Canada should adopt an open science approach for federally funded scientific and research outputs. And there are 9 other recommendations, obviously. And the second and third ones really do focus on the engagement with the federal government science community, and making sure that they in fact are able to drive the process. Next slide, please. So while we are looking at open by default, and that is deemed to cover the full spectrum that is usually seen as being part of open science, there certainly is an emphasis in the first stages to look at open federal science articles and publications, and a realization that we need to develop approaches and look at more consultations before actually moving forward on the scientific and research data aspects, and learning from a lot of the developments that have been taking place in the Canadian environment, because we all know that the last couple of years have seen incredible movement in that area. Next slide, please. So how's the federal government actually going to accomplish implementing this roadmap? What Mona decided to do was create a very high level open science steering committee. And once again, I've named the current members of it, but I think the important thing to see here is that it is co-chaired by the Chief Science Advisor of Canada with the President of Shared Services, who is responsible for the technical infrastructure for the federal government. And it does include the Acting Chief Information Officer of Canada, Associate Secretary of Treasury Board, who's responsible for overseeing the digital initiatives, and the acting president of the National Research Council, so one of the organizations, probably one of the premier organizations that is responsible for doing research in the federal government context. And then myself in my new role as the Librarian and Archivist of Canada, since the Libraries and Archives Canada is responsible for the preservation and access to the government record, of which research plays a very important role. So next slide, please. So where are we in this process? Certainly since the launch in February of the Open Science Roadmap, there have been consultations and discussions within the federal research community. And the work has begun to look at developing action plans in support of the implementation. Interestingly enough, the steering committee first met in March, about a week before the pandemic was announced. And our second meeting is tomorrow. There's been quite a bit of work done in the interim, but tomorrow we will be looking at slightly revising the timelines in terms of deadlines that were recommended in the roadmap because COVID-19 has had an impact. We'll also be looking at a guidance framework for federal government science in the context of open science, and then looking at how we can move ahead with the action planning to be sure that we are in fact supporting the federal scientists in moving forward and specifically in moving on the first stages of having open by default federal science articles and publications. We are also quite keen to look at how we can leverage existing infrastructure and existing networks to be sure that we are part of the larger science community of Canada. And so we'll be reaching out and working in collaboration with partners. I should add, just before we move on to our next presenter, that in fact, all the issues that Richard's going to bring up are shared by federal government researchers. So I think it's very important to understand that just because a researcher works for the federal government doesn't mean that they don't have the same opportunities and challenges that researchers in other research and academic institutions have. And so we are busily trying to analyze some of the implications around things like intellectual property and looking at questions around confidentiality and privacy. And of course, in the federal government, you have the added facet of national security, which can be a challenge in terms of looking at how to ensure that open by default is actually meaningful and makes accessible the research outputs of the federal government community. So with that, I'll turn the microphone back to David.
Great, thanks so much, Leslie. And I think now we'll just turn to you, Richard, and hear your presentation and then go to the Q&A. Thank you so much, Leslie.
That's great. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, David. Thank you, Mark. As I wait for my slides to come up, I'll just take a moment to acknowledge that in our various parts of the country, we're sitting on traditional land of various sorts. And that will become relevant in a minute because a previous session or webinar dealt with specifically Indigenous data and how to treat it. So I want to come back to that. Anyway, I want to take the perspective today of the researcher and some of the barriers. I've done a lot of work in open science, particularly in the life sciences. So there might be a slight skew there in terms of how I present it. Mark, next slide, please. So the central question I want to ask is, why don't more researchers adopt open science practices? If you asked most researchers, they say, yeah, it's great, 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 but I have this issue or that issue. So there is a normative question about whether we should adopt it or not. But I think that has largely been overcome by community norms. The bigger problem is, will I participate? What are the barriers to me participating? And I want to look at three kinds of barriers. One are legal barriers, and I probably would stick in consent issues and Indigenous issues here. Technological issues, so what's stopping me from doing it in fact as opposed to in law, and then some normative issues that underline why we might do this or why I might not. We did a study a few years ago as the Montreal Neurological Institute and hospital adopted an open science platform. While it was going through the process, we interviewed members of the community and tried to suss out what was exciting about open science, but also some of the barriers. So if you go to that article, we relay some of our findings, and I use it in what follows. Mark, next slide, please. Okay, so at first you would think that law is not a major barrier, and I think that's right, but it is playing a role in the background. Certainly consent rules are important, especially when we're dealing with Indigenous populations, minority populations, and others whose data, especially in the health side, may give rise to deep concern. So I'm putting those aside, not because they're unimportant, but because the RDC already dealt with some of these issues before, and they deserve their own webinar. But there are other legal issues that I do want to concentrate on, and that is copyright, patents, and contracts. So for copyright, the data itself, and so copyright applies to the databases and articles and so on. So there are obviously article issues here, but the data itself is not protectable through copyright. So fundamental concept in copyright law that you cannot protect data, but you can protect the way data is organized. So when you construct a database and you make choices about what goes in and what doesn't, that is subject to copyright, and in Europe, subject to some specific legislation dealing with database protection. So if you were just to go in and copy someone's data set, the database, the whole thing and the way it was structured, you in fact would be potentially infringing copyright. But there's one way around that. You can't get copyright in, let's say, a phone book by last name, first name, address, and phone number, because everyone does this. So to the extent that there are common norms about how one collects or stores data within the database, it would be hard for the database owner to claim that there is in fact copyright in the database construction. Next slide, please, Mark. Patents. So generally when we're talking about open science, at least in this context, we're talking about sharing information and people can use it. And so patents don't apply to raw information in the same way that copyright doesn't apply to data. But there's a nagging question in the background that we seldom address, or at least in my opinion, because I keep talking about it and it seems new, is if I share knowledge, but you can't use it, then it's not terribly useful. And that's where patents come in. So if there are patents that block certain uses of data, and let's say the data is very specific to a technology, a drug, something else, and I want to use that data to improve or change or modify something that's patented, I could be blocked. So even though I have access to the data, doesn't mean that I can use it. There's also the fact that generally speaking, the data won't be shared in order to preserve rights to acquire a patent. So it might delay the public disclosure of data, at least until I have a patent application in, but there's that. So 2 levels concern. When do I release the data? Second, can I actually use that data in certain settings? If I'm just dealing with general data that has no technological application, this does not apply. Even if there are some exceptions that would allow me to use the data for research purposes. So if I'm a researcher, whether in government or in a university, generally Canada's pretty generous at allowing people to use the data for that purpose. At some point, if I move to developing a new product, I've improved upon an existing product using this data. At that point, I might run into problems. The situation in the United States is quite different. It's much less clear that there is this broad exception, except if I'm developing drugs where there's a broad protection for research. And then there's contract. One of the largest legal barriers is not actually intellectual property. It is the set of contracts entered into between people when they share materials. Because again, sharing data is not very useful in certain areas unless I can also share the materials. In the life sciences, unless you can replicate my experiment, which means you need access to my data, and my materials, and my tools, the data is just meaningless. However, there are contractual provisions that limit what one can do with materials and may set out rights about patents and other things. In fact, in some studies coming out of the United States, it's these agreements that represent the largest barrier to people being able to share information. We can limit that through norm development. That is, if there is a norm that universities broadly share data and don't require MTAs, then it will be much easier to share it without restriction. Next slide, please, Mark. Okay, the technological, and this is certainly not my area. I will defer questions to Leslie on perhaps some of these things, but I just want to raise them because they're connected to the other 2 barriers. There's a question of what to share, right? Sharing data, as I said, by itself in many fields is not enough. If you don't also share how you collected that data and other aspects of the data, limitations on it. So the metadata has to be shared, plus materials and tools. So we shouldn't just be focusing on sharing publications or sharing data sets if we're not also sharing the things that make those viable in the research setting so that I can replicate it. And then there's a question of where to share. Everybody's got their favorite database. Even in open, just because we have open doesn't mean we're all using the same database. So I work with some researchers in the brain space, and they take different pictures of the brain and data about the brain, but they're all different. And so there's a problem of they don't map onto each other, et cetera. How do I make sure my data is accessible to other people in a format they can use? Where do I store it is part of it. So Europe is trying to answer this through the European Open Science Cloud. We'll see, they've been doing this for a number of years. They're supposed to come out with a final report in the new year. We'll see what they do. But part of the idea is to build the infrastructure that tells you where the data is at least. There are questions about the format of the data. Again, that ties to potentially intellectual property. How do we ensure credit? So not technically within copyright, but if I use Creative Commons licenses often to access certain databases, then I could impose obligations to give me credit, and credit will be important for normative issues that I'll come to next. And then finally, who pays for this? Data is not free. That was the biggest lie I've ever heard. It costs a lot of money to collect data, to package data, to store data, to make sure it's interoperable. Who's paying for it? Next slide, please. And then there are a whole bunch of normative elements. And so what we have learned through interviewing people is while there's general, especially in Canada, support for open science, they don't want it imposed on them. They don't want the government, they don't want the granting council saying, you have to do this. They don't even necessarily want their university to do it. They want to feel that they're part of the discussion to bring about open science. That is, we want the carrot, not the stick. The stick tends to rub people the wrong way, and they're more likely to defect. And there's really no effective mechanism to enforce this across the board. So we have to engage people, and that slows down the process. Took the Montreal Neuro about 18 months to have these conversations, and that's just one unit within one university. There are also issues about how do we reward people or acknowledge at least that they're sharing. Right now, a lot of our structures punish people for sharing because they don't get credit. So, you know, I spend a lot of time packaging my data. Well, I'm not, can you move back one, Mark? Sorry. Thank you. You don't get credit for having shared data. And you spent time. So we don't have mechanisms to give the proper credit for it. And we need to think about this, particularly in respect of promotion and tenure decisions and research grants. How do we acknowledge and measure the amount of sharing I've done? And how do I get rewarded, and how is that taken into account? And we need to develop norms about that at the university level, the department level, but also within our research councils. There's also a concern about new researchers. So especially in some science-based areas, one of the things that the young researcher brings with her is a data set that's proprietary to her that she can mine. Well, if everything's open, what does she have instead? So how do we make hiring decisions when in fact, the person may have given away their data? Next slide, please. Granting councils have a role to play in this, as I mentioned, in terms of the criteria used to assess research grants, but also in setting up research opportunities that are only for those who agree to certain open science principles. So you don't have to agree. This is not the stick, this is a carrot, but if you do, and you know, we can enumerate what those might be, here's a fund of money available to you. The Wellcome Trust did this at a small scale starting about 2 years ago. And then we need to measure the outcomes. How do we assess the effect of open sharing? Because that again goes into bolstering the norm. If people see that it's working in the sense of accelerating research, people building on research in terms of high quality people being produced, collaborations, et cetera. But what are those measures? We did some work on that, and you can see the study there where we suggest a fairly long list of potential measures. And then, of course, they have to provide the funding to actually curate the data, curate the metadata, package the materials, and upload it. Next slide, please. Universities obviously have a role both in promotion and tenure, but again, how do we create the message for junior researchers that it's okay? There's much more openness to open science among incoming researchers, but they're afraid about how this is going to affect their careers. They need to see senior researchers doing open science and creating opportunities from them. And we need consistent messages. We can't have our promotion criteria, hiring criteria contradict what we're doing. Next slide. Okay, so one of the things I just want to get across is that these are not independent barriers. Sometimes the solution can cross them. So as I mentioned before, in terms of database, while there is the potential to have property, copyright in the database structure, we can undermine that by developing norms of how we store data and what the database looks like. If it is completely developed by the community and I'm not adding anything to it, then it's hard for me, at least in the non-European context, to claim that I have a right. The same thing around MTAs I already mentioned. If we can build in normative expectations that MTAs will not restrict access, will not impose patents, then we will have a more open framework in which to work. And again, promotion and tenure can help induce those researchers who are currently publishing in closed high impact journals to maybe think about other places if we reward them for publishing in open access publications rather than closed. I think that's my last slide, so I'll end there.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Richard, for that. The presentations have generated a number of questions already, some of which I think are on a fairly technical end of the spectrum. But let me start off by just asking one question of Leslie with respect to the development of the roadmap and the supports that the roadmap has received within government. Did you feel that the data science and the data management stewards community was well reflected in the development of the roadmap, Leslie?
Well, I would say that the people who worked on the advisory committee were all responsible in certain ways for the research and data communities in their departments. And so our model was designed that the members would be consulting within their departments to try to bring forward some of those concerns. And, when I saw the question, I thought, oh, that's an interesting question that perhaps, that it might have been a benefit to have a more direct input.
It's not too late, I presume, though, because the steering committee will continue to do its work.
That's right. Right. So that's something I may bring up tomorrow.
Ah, well, there you go. Richard, there are a couple of questions in the Q&A box that I'd like to just try to thread them together a little bit, because they, on the one hand, they deal with other factors that could be normative and legal, like privacy. But then there's also, some of these other questions here too about the limits of a normative approach in terms of groups or a whole state, a whole research community globally just defecting and saying, open science, open data, thanks, but no thanks. So I guess for Richard, just first of all, in terms of your thinking about the interaction of norms and laws, both in terms of a country or internationally, how do you deal with some of these issues, say if a privacy concern arises or people just not interested in participating? And Leslie, you might have some thoughts about this as well.
Yeah, my basic view is not everybody should be doing open science. It is what we want are different models of how we do research and innovation. And so if some people want to do it their way, that's fine. And there should be opportunities for them. They can get private sector funding. They can get public sector funding, although I would probably tie some obligation if they take public money to share. And so we're looking at a subset of people who actually want to do open science and trying to remove the barriers that are preventing them. We can have larger conversations to try and develop and deepen the norm of open sharing, but really my focus has been on those who are interested. With the underlying presumption, and it only is a presumption now, that those researchers will be more successful, right? One of the reasons we're doing open science is we think it's better. If we didn't think it's better, then why do it? So if that's correct, then those who adopt open science and participate in it will see benefits that other people will see. And I hope that people will defect in the good way. They'll defect from a proprietary model to an open model when they see their peers getting access to research funds, working in a community, being able to do things that they can't. So I'm not really worried about the people who defect. I don't think that is a major issue. In terms of a single project that's open, again, I'm not that worried, because no matter how open you are, a large part of what you're doing is closed. We have interpersonal relationships, we have know-how, where are things going? And so only those who participate in open science are actually going to be able to benefit. Right? You'll be excluded. If you decide that you're going to go off and do a proprietary way, good luck, but you're not going to get access to my know-how. And again, I think that that is going to give a benefit. Now, if I'm wrong and open science provides no benefit, then why shouldn't they defect, right? They should. So it doesn't bother me as long as there's enough of a balance in the ecosystem to allow some people to go open science, there's support, there's the infrastructure, and so on. As long as there's enough of that, I think there are enough researchers who will adopt it, and we'll get a real world experiment going on to see what works best.
Okay, thanks. Leslie, did you have some thoughts about that?
Well, I would just add, I should probably have clarified that the Open Science Roadmap that I've been speaking about is actually an open science roadmap for federally funded science and research through government departments and agencies. So it's that subgroup that Richard was referring to that actually has public funding. So, you know, that creates sort of a certain level of responsibility for the public funding, you know, to support its funders, which of course are Canadians. So it adds a little bit of a reference point, I think, to the Open Science Roadmap in relation to the Canadian model. And I agree with a lot of what Richard's saying. I'm a strong believer that you demonstrate the benefits of things by doing. So you need those demonstration projects. You need to actually see that there is tangible benefit. And if there's a tangible benefit, then our reward system will make the model successful. And I think we'll always have a hybrid system in the world, because there are many cases where proprietary may be appropriate, you know, due to, you know, commercial advantage or to national security. And I think we have to be cognizant of that.
Right. So I think both of you take the position then that you can have a mix of approaches that would be normative or legal, some contractual, and that it, you know, the judgment has to be applied in order to be able to make decisions about what the best approach is, depending on what your research objectives are, presumably, and then some of the other considerations you were just mentioning, Leslie. I noticed there were quite a number of questions and comments in the Q&A bar that were actually quite technical in nature, about databases and so forth. We don't have a lot of time to go through each one of those individual questions, but I wonder if you could, from your own perspective, sort of comment on what you think the state of play is in Canada with respect to our ability to do open science and have open data, both within government, but also in the higher education sectors, as it really relates to our interoperability and the extent of our digital infrastructure that would support this. And so how are we doing overall? And do you think that there are some obvious places where we need to make some improvements?
Well, maybe I'll jump in first, just because it's interesting that we have this conversation at Libraries and Archives Canada regularly. And in fact, we're in the middle of a digital optimization initiative, which is one of our 2 strategic priorities, really trying to get what is now called DAMs in place. So you've got that data management infrastructure, and you've got, ability to ingest. And we all know, as Richard highlighted, that data out of context can actually be relatively useless. And some of our data has quite sophisticated context. And that's one of the challenges, is if you, from an archival point of view, where you do want to be able to make it accessible, if you're just preserving the data, you are probably not preserving the value of the data for future use or reference. And so we are having conversations, I think, amongst places like Libraries and Archives Canada with universities in terms of how we look at ensuring that we do have an infrastructure that's robust enough to be able to support those who do want to be able to make their data available through open science. And it's not a quick or easy fix, and it's something that's going to require ongoing evolution and development, because we all know that technology is moving at a very fast pace.
Right.
So I would say we've got three different worlds where open science is working better in some worlds than in not. So the government, I think, especially through the chief scientist, is trying to build norms around open science. And hopefully Leslie and her group will move that from just norm development into practice recommendations. We then have the universities, most of which haven't bought into open science, don't provide haven't really rethought the way they do promotion and tenure, still sign the same old MTAs, still seek patents as their pathway. And so, with a few exceptions, like the Montreal Neurological Institute, the Structural Genomics Consortium, at the academic level, there's no institutional support for a growing number of researchers who are interested. Interestingly, the MNI, when they moved to open science, found it was a great recruitment tool because there are a whole bunch of young researchers who are really excited about this and come to them. So hopefully over time, other institutions will see the same thing. And then there's also another level, which is, we talk about open science as just being an academic effort. We're doing innovation in order to improve people's lives. So yes, we want research to progress, but it has to actually turn into innovation, whether social innovation or technological innovation. And we're missing a whole bunch of ingredients there about how do we actually work with the private sector? How do we manage their need to have incentives? How do we manage the areas that are proprietary, even if they want to participate in open? Where's the line between the two? There's been lots of thinking in academia, but that hasn't yet managed to get into public discourse. And there, I would say our Canadian and provincial governments have failed. There've been really no policy development. They've allowed the Structural Genomics Consortium, Montreal Neuro, to sort of try to do this, but there's been no thinking. And there's a real opportunity for Canada, and you can see the logos there. For VIMI, we're trying to do open science drug discovery. We think Canada has a competitive advantage in this area, but it needs government support. No problem in talking to industry and having them involved, but how do we actually make this happen? So I say we're strong in terms of talking about open science at a public level, but we're pretty weak on implementation, and there's very little support for it.
So both of you, of course, Richard still at a university, Leslie recently. So there was a question about the Tri-Council policy on open data, which has been delayed, obviously, like so many things because of the pandemic, and I think is relatively soon to be released. But given what you've just said, Richard, what do you, and Leslie, you're thinking too, but how do you think that this is actually going to be received and adopted by the research community? I mean, are we going to see a wellspring of aligned policies with respect to university handling of data across all sorts of different disciplines, or do you think it's going to be much more passive and people will note it and sort of say, oh, well, that's interesting, we'll pay attention to it?
I'm not an expert I haven't been involved with it, but to me, it's a nice normative statement. Unless you back it up by infrastructure and incentives and real practical things, nothing's going to change.
What do you think, Leslie?
Sadly, I agree with Richard. I think the issue often is around investment, and you can have key people that decide to adopt, and they may be influencers, and that will have an impact. But if the investment hasn't been made to enable the open science, then that is a challenge for the science community. Okay.
There's a nice question in here. I don't know, Richard, if you've read it, but there's a nice question here about the sort of mix of issues about licensing and whether or not you think that we will end up with some improved licensing arrangements and better governance frameworks to accommodate some of the the norms that you were referring to in actual practice? And if you think that that's so, I mean, what would it take actually to get people more literate in improved practices, so to speak, so that we actually have people interacting with these environments in more successful ways for their research?
So if we're talking about university researchers or government researchers, I'm excluding on purpose firms, then talking about licenses already means you've lost the battle. That means you've already obtained intellectual property, and you are now trying to figure out, well, I went to all the expense, delays, costs, transaction costs involved with getting the IP. Now I'm going to impose a second set of transaction costs, which is entering into licenses. If they're not standard, I mean, we can make it better through standard form licensing that the community all adopts, but you're adding layers. My view of open science really is it's out there and anybody could use it. Now, there'll be some circumstances, as Leslie mentioned, where we can't do that. We have privacy issues, we have indigenous communities, and so on. So in those areas, we have no alternative but to engage in these costs because they're worth it. And in there, I think that's where standardization is really important. The UK has a full, robust IP schema, but they've entered into something called the Lambert set of agreements, which standardize license agreements or agreements in general between industry and universities. And they cut the time in half or more in terms of negotiation. So if you're going to have some type of restriction, whether IP, which I strongly recommend universities not obtain, or privacy or other concerns, which we have to take seriously, then standardization greatly reduces the cost. It almost doesn't matter what the license says, as long as we don't need to negotiate it.
Leslie, what do you think?
Richard is an expert in this area, and I really don't have anything to add.
Okay. There was another pretty straightforward question that was asked, which was maybe goes back to this question about not only for researchers at universities, but maybe it can be generalized beyond that, is that people love the access part, but not so much the sharing part. And so there are sometimes some asymmetries. Do you know of any ways in which we can get around some of those asymmetries?
I think they're part of what we have to expect. And again, the gains, I mean, it's better to have someone sharing something than nothing at all. So I think as a condition to being part of a particular project, even if it's a large project, I think there have to be some ground rules about what you have to share. And if you are unwilling to do that, fine, you don't get access to the researchers, the know-how, et cetera. So that to me is where the boundary is. In other cases, we may not be able to go purely open. So much like in Quebec with CRIAC in the aerospace industry, we can create a club good where at least within the community involved, there's complete open sharing. But on the outside, we allow the parties to exploit their intellectual property. So if we can't get pure open science, I don't think, you know, there shouldn't be a purity test here, right? What we're trying to do is accelerate research. So if that just won't fly, then we can try something a little bit less ambitious, but still has quite a bit of sharing. And those are just two particular models. I'm sure we can come up with others.
Leslie, what do you think about this asymmetry in people's behavior? And maybe is it actually part of thinking about the ethos of openness that there should be an expectation of reciprocity?
Well, I think there are very strong networks within researchers, and people will soon identify in their disciplines who the accessors are and who the sharers are. And I think that Richard's quite right. If you can develop a system where there are incentives and there are rewards for sharing, not just accessing, then it will underpin that model and support there being more sharing. So I think it's all part of an ecosystem that you have to be sure may enable accessing, but it may also create those incentives to actually share. And then there, as I say, there's the peer pressure that may come to play.
Right.
Just jump in again, David, just for
absolutely.
I think we put way too much emphasis on free ridership. There's free ridership everywhere, even in proprietary system. Most of that knowledge is not contained to the firm. It leaks out. That's a human problem. We always have leakage. So I think saying you can't even embark on open science because of what's inevitably going to be some free ridership is the wrong question.
Okay.
Agreed. Yep.
Let me ask you a final question that's going to link two themes together. One is how do we actually ensure that Canadian researchers are thinking about open science as a way of promoting international research collaboration, and if you have some specific thoughts about the way in which that has or hasn't happened around COVID-19 and the global response to the pandemic, that I think would be a very interesting thing to bring in here as well. I mean, has COVID-19 in a way kind of made part of the case for openness in science that might change the way researchers think about it here in Canada and with colleagues abroad? Leslie, why don't you start this time around?
Well, I'll jump in on the second part of that question that you had. I was recently involved in a webinar with CADITH, so in relation to health, and Dr. Margaret Sampson was presenting on the impact of COVID on children, because she's at the Canadian Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario. And of course, a lot of the information we have relates to adults, and children are different. They aren't just small adults. And she was highlighting that there's an extraordinary international collaboration in sharing early results of research, and especially preprints of articles, because people need turnaround that's daily or weekly. They cannot be waiting months to be able to find out key protocols and approaches that one may want to take to be able to ensure the safety and security of children. And I was quite amazed to hear some of the examples of the discoveries that had been made through these networks of pediatric researchers, and looking at leveraging the experiences that are being applied to COVID in the hospital. So I think that was the good news side of the story. On the other side, we may find that implementations of things like the Open Science Roadmap for federally funded science and research in Canada may have been delayed by COVID, because the attention obviously may have needed to shift to a response and reaction to COVID. So I think we're seeing both situations arise in relation to what is a pretty unique experience that we're having right now in terms of those people that are still alive today in the world, and most of us not having experienced as massive a pandemic in the recent past.
Richard, what's your observation?
I think what the pandemic, and it's bad, but the good side, as Leslie said, is it demonstrated that all the myths we had about how you have to organize science and how you share data are not so strong, are not so real. That the transaction cost of moving from one system to another would be impossible. We've shown the opposite. I mean, we would not have a vaccine today if it hadn't been for open science in the opening months of the COVID crisis, because we had open sharing of the viruses, of the DNA sequences, and that led directly to BioNTech, Moderna being able to create extremely rapidly the mRNA sequence they used. We've had openness in other dimensions as well, but I think that's the most remarkable. The question is, was it a one-off? Is it because we were in a crisis, so people suspended everything, but they're going to go back to the old way. I think some of the arguments have been undermined, that open science will slow down, will not provide incentives. In fact, it does it's accelerated research. But for long-term stability, I don't think it has demonstrated by itself that this is the way for everything. I think we need other experiments. I think we use it to build momentum, to build more experiments in a normal world, and let that prove or disprove the theory that open science is the way to go.
Very good. Well, listen, I'd like to thank both of you for extremely thought-provoking presentations and even more thought-provoking responses in the Q&A. And thanks to everybody who put in comments and questions in the Q&A. I'm sorry we can't get to all of them. I tried to link as many of them as possible so we could at least get a response close to what you were interested in having answered. So again, thanks to everyone for joining today. And I'll just turn the mic back over to Mark for his closing remarks.
Great, thanks David, and thanks Richard and Leslie both for, as David suggested, the presentations and the thought-provoking responses and discussion. One of our attendees has just commented in the chat that they wish there was another hour of this. So I think in order to find our way to those norms and practices that do accelerate and enhance the practice of open science in our research community, we need to have these kinds of discussions as often as we can. So thanks to all who attended. Thanks to David for facilitating today's event. As I said, the webinar recording will be available shortly. Everybody who has registered, whether you signed in or not, will get a link to that. And I did earlier put in a link to the RDC archive webinars page, so you can check for the previous 4 data ownership events which David highlighted, and this one will show up shortly as well. So thanks all, and enjoy almost weekend. Cheers.